Hello, everyone, and welcome to this interview this evening. This is one of the regular interviews we do on Enfield Voices and broadcast through GlobalNet 21 as well. And today we're going to talk to Adam McGibbon. Adam is someone who's just recently come to live in Enfield and has sort of jumped in at the deep end and decided to get involved in a campaign that he's particularly interested in, which is Divest Enfield. So we're going to talk to him about that. So, Adam, welcome for being here tonight and for taking part in this interview. I was just wondering first if you'd like to tell us, why are you so concerned with the issue of fossil fuels?
Hi, Francis. Thanks for having me on. So yes, why am I so concerned about the issue of fossil fuels, and why are Divest Enfield concerned about it? Well, essentially, Divest Enfield is a community campaign that's campaigning for Enfield Council to divest, that is, remove the stocks that it holds in fossil fuel companies. Now, Enfield Council's currently got about 60 million invested in fossil fuel companies via its pension fund. So I'm here to tell you about that campaign, but I'm also here to tell you about why we think that's a bad thing. We think it's a bad thing that Enfield Council are invested in fossil fuel companies because fossil fuel companies are the biggest obstacles to solving climate change. Fossil fuel companies knew about the climate change problem as long ago as the 1970s, according to recent documents that have been unearthed, and yet even though they knew about the dangers, they spent decades undermining action to stop climate change by funding disinformation, capturing politics, particularly in the United States, and not changing their business model in any way. We know from an organization called Carbon Tracker that there is more fossil fuel reserves held in the reserves of these fossil fuel companies, the world's biggest fossil fuel companies, that is safe to burn. So of all the fossil fuel companies in the world with their current proven reserves, if they burnt those, there would be so much carbon dioxide put into the atmosphere that we would have no hope of keeping climate change under a safe level. So that's why we're concerned about it. This week, in fact, is a pretty big week because the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change have put out a report saying that we have 12 years left to get ourselves onto a low carbon pathway and avert the worst crises of climate breakdown. And that kind of climate breakdown could involve, literally hundreds of millions of people dying in floods, heat waves, sea level rises, really, really serious humanitarian stuff, and not just something as abstract as the environment. So it's about our future. And that's why we want Enfield Council to divest its fossil fuel holdings. We're not the only.
Can I ask you, you mentioned the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change. They've actually said, haven't they, that instead of having a 2% increase, in order not to have the catastrophes you're talking about, it should be 1.5% increase. Now, does that give an added urgency to the campaign that you're involved in?
It completely does. So the thing that came out of the agreement that came out in Paris in 2015, the Paris Climate Agreement, said that we must hold climate change either below 2 degrees centigrade or 1.5 degrees centigrade. And the science that's been done in the meantime suggests that even the 2 degrees centigrade target above pre-industrial levels would be incredibly hazardous. And a lot of small island states, for example, would essentially disappear from that. So the IPCC have come out and said we need to do much more to keep ourselves under 1.5 degrees centigrade pre-industrial increase. And that does give an added urgency. And you'll seen this week that the UK government are reassessing their own climate change targets within that. So we need to do much more of everything. And divesting from fossil fuel companies is one thing that we can do. We need to plant new forests. We need to get off fossil fuels in our power stations. We need to drive electric cars. We need to do all sorts of things. And fossil fuel divestment is one way of doing that, taking your money away from the fossil fuel companies.
And do you think the investment is a good way to go forward? Why have you chosen that particular route? Because you could have chosen many other routes to try and tackle climate change or mitigate its effects.
That's a great question. So, a lot of it can seem a little bit counterintuitive. So it's always worth explaining why divestment is a good idea. But essentially, divestment campaigns have got a long and honorable history. You might have heard, of course, that the most famous one is probably the divestment campaign to divest from apartheid South Africa in the 1970s and 1980s. That showed how you can use the divestment tactic to essentially show people that investing in fossil fuels is a bad investment. So if local governments, respected institutions take their money out of fossil fuels, it gives a signal to the markets and it gives a signal to society at large that this is a bad investment. And in the 1970s and 80s, with the apartheid boycott, the thing that happened was, as more and more respected institutions backed out of investing in apartheid South Africa, eventually the government was forced to take action. So this is about building political will to tackle fossil fuel companies, and we know that governments are sometimes afraid of taking them on. This is about building political will and political capital to make sure that we take them on. We take our money away from them and we say they're a bad investment. And it's worth saying, we're not the only people doing this in Enfield. There's a worldwide divestment movement of which we're only a tiny part, which had some really interesting successes recently. I think there's a total of $6 trillion in assets have been divested from fossil fuels, and that includes the New York City's pension fund, the Irish sovereign wealth fund, lots of cities around the world. And right here in London, we've had Waltham Forest, Southwark Council, Islington Council divesting their pension funds of fossil fuels. So we're hoping that Enfield will be the next council to do this. But we think there's an issue around the signal that you send out to the world. So Enfield has done some really good things for the environment. We know that the council have got a really interesting climate change plan for climate mitigation, wetlands, that sort of thing. But you can't reconcile that with actually being invested in fossil fuel companies and actually giving them your money. So we need them to take that action so they have coordinated, joined up action on fossil fuels and on climate change.
How important is it to understand that you can act locally on this? Because a lot of people believe the problem's so great that local authorities can't do much, and yet in many ways local authorities in some places, particularly in parts of the United States, are leading the way on tackling climate change. How important is it to get our local authority to understand they can play a significant role?
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head there. One of the big problems of climate change is that it's such an intangible issue. It feels like such a massive problem. How do you go about solving this huge problem? And, we sometimes hear it said on the TV that people ought to change their light bulbs or, drive a slightly cleaner car. But I find all of that quite disempowering. Ultimately, it's up to us to grasp the nettle and deal with this at a local issue. Because if at a local level, if everyone does that, then we'll solve the problem. But what's wanting is the inspiration to let people know that they can do it at a local level. So this is one way in which you could take a really concrete action at a local level. And you're right to say, of course, that in some local governments, particularly in some of the more decentralized states in the world, like Spain, USA, where there's lots of power below the federal level, there is lots of stuff happening. Those people are leading the way. So this is one thing that you can do in your local area. Basically, everyone can do this in the UK. Everybody has got a local authority. They have a pension fund. Pretty much all of them, apart from the ones that I've named, Waltham Forest, Southwark and Islington, are currently invested in some kind of fossil fuel. So there's a part for everyone to play here to get their local governments to divest from fossil fuels.
Quite interesting. We had a House of Commons meeting in education yesterday, and teachers were saying there that young people in schools, the thing they're interested in more than anything else, not interested in equations or algebra. What they're really interested in is climate change, and they want to get involved. How did you get involved? What's your background? Where did you come from on this particular issue?
So as you can probably tell, I'm originally not from around here. I'm from Belfast in Northern Ireland. I became interested in the issue around the time of the Stern report in 2006. And for those of you that may not remember, the Stern report was a report done by Nicholas Stern, the former chief economist to the UK government. And he did a report and said that basically the economics of climate change are so serious they could lead to massive economic breakdown as well as environmental catastrophe. And at the time, that spurred quite a lot of media interest in climate change. So there was lots and lots of climate change stories around that time. And it really worried me that I didn't really see anybody else acting on this issue, and people didn't seem to think it was a big deal. So out of concern for the future, I kind of got involved, and I was involved in a political party for a long time in Northern Ireland who deal with environmentalist issues. So I was very involved in formal politics for a while, where I attempted to help get people elected to office who understood the scale of the problem. I'm now politically independent, so I've come to Enfield. Me and my girlfriend are settling down here, so I'm going to be a long-time Enfield resident. So I thought it was time that I became involved in the local community, really. And when I lived in Southwark, I was a long-suffering renter across all sorts of different places in London. I was a little bit involved in the fossil-free campaign there, and I was inspired by how a very small group of people got together and convinced their local council that this isn't something you'd want to invest in. And since then, Southwark has said they will divest from fossil fuels, and over the last couple of years, their investments have been dwindling in fossil fuels, have been dwindling to nothing, which is great to see. But largely, I'm involved because you alluded to children there. I'm really concerned about the future of the planet, and it's not something anymore that's going to happen in 2 or 3 generations' time. This is something that's going to affect us in our lifetimes, and it's going to affect our kids' future. So I'm motivated by a faith to build a better future, and I think this is one way you can do it. It's one way that anybody can be involved in doing it.
Okay, well, you mentioned that Enfield has got £60 million in fossil fuels, which for some of us seems like a huge amount. I mean, how are you going to persuade them to shift that amount of money across to ethical investments?
So it's important to say that that's actually quite a small fraction of their overall fund. So what we're not asking them to do is to take a massive chunk of the fund and move it somewhere else, because obviously the people that manage Enfield Council's pension fund, not only do they have to think about these types of ethical considerations, like investing in things like arms, tobacco, fossil fuels, but they also have to think about what's going to get a good return for the people that invest in this pension fund, what's going to get a good return for the people who are going to rely on this fund for the rest of their lives in their old age. So we want to convince them by saying that not only is this good for the planet, it's going to be good for your pocket as well. There is more and more evidence out there that fossil fuel investments are becoming increasingly risky investments. And we've had Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, actually come out and say this over the last couple of years, that fossil fuel investments are becoming more and more speculative. They're becoming more and more risky as the world moves towards a situation where we can now envision a world free of fossil fuels. So as those assets become more and more risky, you're running the risk of running a loss. So there may come a point in the future where Mark Carney refers to the stranded assets, where at some point in the future, when we realize that there are too many fossil fuels in reserves that we can actually burn, and the world creates policies to accommodate that, fossil fuels will suddenly massively drop in value. And if you've got lots and lots invested in fossil fuels, that means whatever you've got invested will drop in value as well. So not only is it good for the planet, we think it's good for their financial duty as well to actually get out of these before it's too late. And we've seen quite a lot of evidence coming out recently that fossil-free funds tend to do as well as, or even better than funds that are invested in fossil fuels. Fossil fuels don't lead the market like they used to. They're on their way out, so better to get out of them while you still can.
I mean, that's sort of interesting, because people think, £60 million shifting, what's going to happen to my pension fund? But, the amount of investment that's gone in fossil fuels over the generations has been huge. The amount that's gone in renewables has been very little. But solar and wind now is almost cheaper, if not cheaper, than fossil fuels. So what you're saying is that's the future, not only in terms of energy, but in terms of financial return on investment as well.
Absolutely. To give you an example of how fossil fuel assets can become stranded as a result of something you've just alluded to, solar and wind becoming cheaper and cheaper, there are now coal plants in India that cannot be switched on because switching them on would run a loss, because solar power is now so cheap in India that it's cheaper to just do the solar power instead of turning on a loss-making coal plant. So that coal plant can't make any money. It's therefore a stranded asset. So the people that have invested in that aren't going to get a return on their investment. So you can see how, as renewables become cheaper and cheaper, as we move away from fossil fuels, fossil fuel investments become incredibly risky. So we're better to get out of them and invest in what the future is instead of the energy of the past.
I don't know if you saw the interview that we did with Nessel Kalaskan, the leader of Enfield Council, where she said, yes, yours is a good campaign and we're looking into it, but she made no commitments about it yet. I mean, how do you respond to that?
Well, I'm glad that there are quite a lot of people in Enfield who are responding well to the campaign. So it's not only us. There's also faith groups that are on board. We're looking into community organisations. We're trying to build our crowd, if you like. But amongst the people that are supportive of us or our agenda, I'm quite glad to say that the 3 Enfield MPs, Bambos Charalambos, Joan Ryan, and Kate Ossamore, have all signed up to a very similar campaign called Divest Parliament, where 150 plus current MPs have signed up to a pledge to get the parliamentary pension fund divested from fossil fuels. And I think that's a real sign of leadership, and that if they could get their fund divested, it naturally follows that Enfield Council should divest their fund as well. So great to have that support. Great that they are looking into it. I hope to meet them sometime in the future and explain to them why I think this is the best thing for all of us to do. And another high-profile supporter of this concept that we have is Sadiq Khan, the mayor. He actually came out in April this year and said that London boroughs should divest their holdings from fossil fuels. So there are quite a lot of people, politicians out there, who already agree with us. We're hoping that Enfield Council will soon agree with us too and take steps to quickly divest from fossil fuels, so that we've got a pension fund that's, not only full of clean energy, sound investments, but it's also future-proof as well.
So Enfield Council hasn't yet met you yet. Nessel Kalaskan hasn't met you, or Doug Taylor, who I think overlooks the pension fund, hasn't yet met you. Do you plan to make contact with them in the near future?
Yeah, so we've got a meeting booked in with Doug Taylor very soon, and I'm very much looking forward to that. Looking forward to a really good exchange of views. Really excited about the possibility of talking to them in more detail about it. And if you look at some of the other divestment campaigns that have been successful in London, they've employed a strategy of getting out there and building support amongst the people, talking to other organisations, faith groups, that sort of thing, and also speaking to the councillors on the inside. So we'll be doing the same thing. We'll be building up our crowds outside of the council chamber, and we'll be engaging with people inside the council chamber as well. And it's also worth saying we're going to make contact with trade unions too. So Unison, one of the UK's biggest trade unions, and one that represents a fair chunk of the council's workforce, Unison nationally is actually supportive of this campaign, and they've actually produced a toolkit for Unison activists to help get their pension funds out of fossil fuels. So hopefully we'll be meeting Unison in the near future as well to discuss that with them.
Have you come across with any resistance at all, like people saying, it's much better to stay with these companies and try to change them from the inside?
So we haven't had that in Enfield yet, but it's certainly a view that we have heard before. People make the argument that we shouldn't sell our stocks in these companies. We should keep our stocks and use those stocks to engage with the company. And to a certain extent, you can see where people are coming from, because that kind of shareholder activism has worked in the past with certain companies, but it tends to work with companies where you just want them to make a small change, where you want them to, be more transparent, or, you want their chief executive to, publish whatever he's paid on an annual basis, that sort of thing. We know from academic studies that engagement doesn't work when it comes to fossil fuel companies. It does work in other industries. The reasons why it hasn't worked, we've got 3 decades of evidence to show that engaging with fossil fuel companies hasn't worked. They haven't changed their business model at all. They continue to pollute. Yes, we've managed to make them be a little bit more transparent, but they're still destroying the planet in a slightly more transparent way. So that's not exactly what we want. There's an organization called Fossil Free Indexes, which is separate to the Fossil Free campaign. And they've shown that despite the amount of shareholder resolutions that come up at fossil fuel company AGMs increasing, a lot of them aren't getting passed. And in fact, 62% of the shareholder resolutions that came up in 2016 at fossil fuel AGMs were the exact same motions that came up in 2015. So you can see how, although these motions are being put forward, they're not being accepted. So the engagement doesn't appear to be working. And of course, engagement only works if you're willing to say, look, this isn't working, we're going to sell our shares now. So you need to be willing to sell your stocks as well. But it's also worth saying that there are quite a lot of really high profile financial voices, not activists like me, really, really high profile pension fund managers who are coming out and saying it's time to stop. It's time to just sell the stocks. There's a guy called Tom Zanzillo, who was the deputy comptroller of the New York State Pension Fund. That's one of the biggest pension funds in the world. He actually wrote an article for the Financial Times a couple of months ago. The headline of the article was "Stop trying to reason with fossil fuel companies and sell their shares." So he's come to the conclusion, and again, this isn't someone who's an activist, this isn't someone who's a lefty, this is someone who is a hard-nosed financial investment banker who said, look, this isn't working, time for us to sell our shares. This is the only way to get them to listen. This is the only way to make a change. So we do hear the engagement argument quite a lot, but ultimately we don't think it stacks up. Ultimately, we sell them.
Okay, so tell us something about your local campaign. Are you a bunch of individuals? I mean, how many people do you have involved? And you talked about local groups, faith groups, and so on. I mean, do they sort of come in a meeting? Do you get them all together, or do you work on a network basis? How do you work?
So we work on a network basis. There is a small core group who coordinate the campaign, and then there are groups that we are affiliating ourselves to and getting in touch with. So at the moment, we've had a lot of engagement with faith groups, and we know from London wide there's a lot of support out there. So we know that CAFOD, the Catholic Development Charity, are very supportive of this agenda. They want to see a fossil-free world as well. We know that the Quakers are extremely supportive. We've had some really good contact with the Unified Reformed Church in Brighton, and we hope to build on that. So there's a lot of goodwill out there from the faith communities, and you can see why that is, because ultimately, if you look at every major religion, it teaches you that you should look after God's creation, and at the minute we're really not doing that. The Church of England has actually sold its stocks in fossil fuel companies, and we've had the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, coming out and saying some really positive things about the divestment campaign. And we've also had Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who of course was not only he was very, very involved in the apartheid campaign. He wrote an article for The Guardian a couple of years ago saying we need an apartheid-style boycott to save the planet. So there's a lot in the faith community that we hope to reach out for in Brighton. We hope to make more links with trade unions, community groups, with the Better Streets in Enfield group. So we're really at the beginning of this process of reaching out to more people. So it's really exciting, actually, because we find that the vast majority of people we spoke to are really supportive. So we hope to build that crowd until Enfield Council divest there.
I think it's important to say, you keep saying in Brighton rather than in Enfield, and I thought I ought to tell people that you just moved to Enfield and you were in Brighton.
Did I say that? I'm sorry.
So it's easy to say where you came from, because you were active down there and now you're active here.
Yes, and of course we were just having a conversation about Brighton before we went live there. Sorry about that, everybody.
Yeah, no, that's okay.
Long day.
So you're talking about national groups, like national churches and so on.
Yes.
But presumably you would love local groups, local Quakers, who I know are very supportive. Rupert Price is an admin person on Enfield Voices and a strong Quaker as well.
Wow.
But you would like these local groups to get in touch with you and come on board with this campaign?
Yes, absolutely. So we definitely want to reach out to more people. So yeah, we'll be doing that in the next couple of weeks and making those connections. So obviously I'd encourage anybody who's watching this to get in touch. If you want to collaborate or talk about it some more, I'm always happy to talk, as you can probably tell. But yes, we'll be reaching out to lots of these groups over the next couple of months as well.
But do you have a membership, or is it just, supporters who come together and talk about how you can campaign and what you can do?
So we don't have a formal membership. You don't pay money to be involved, but we have groups of supporters, and we find that kind of loose structure is better, because if you ask someone to sign up to something, it seems like a bit of a commitment, whereas we want people to feel as welcome as possible, and we want people to come in even if they've never done anything like this before. When I was in the fossil free Southwark campaign, helping the divestment campaign there, we had loads of different people who had never been involved in politics or activism before. And in fact, we had quite a lot of people who were actually members of the Southwark Council Pension Fund, which gave us extra credibility, because here were these members of the pension fund saying, I want my pension fund to be fossil free. So that'll be another group that we'll be reaching out to in Enfield, people who are members of the pension fund currently, whether that's people who are council officers or people who are retirees.
How long have you actually been running? I mean, when did you start?
So the campaign began, I didn't start it, it's important to say, there are lots of other people involved, but I've become very active recently. It was started in February this year in the run to the local elections. So we wrote to every candidate in the local elections, asking them for their views on divestment. Some of the people who have been elected as councillors, very fortuitously, canvassed some of our members. So we had some really good doorsteps conversations about divestment with them. And since then, we've been growing from there, basically. Did
you get any hostility from the candidates at all when you canvassed them?
I think we got from no hostility from candidates during the elections, but I think there were a lot of councillors who were loath to make promises on the doorstep. And I think that's totally fair enough. I don't hold that against them at all. This is a very technical area. It involves people's savings. It involves people's livelihoods. So we weren't expecting anybody to turn around the doorstep and go, yes, absolutely, I will do that. But we found that at first they were a little bit tentative. But we know from some of our engagement that there are councillors on Enfield Council, both within the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, who do support our agenda. They might not feel they're able to say so publicly at the minute, but that support is building within those two parties. So we're quite excited about that and look forward to building more upon that engagement and just talking to as many councillors as possible.
I guess one of the reasons you got some reservation on the doorstep was many of them didn't understand, in the sense that they were worried about pension funds being depleted. And the argument that you've given today, and the way in which renewables are the way of the future in terms of investment, is something that maybe some of them hadn't really considered as a possibility.
Absolutely, yeah. I think the thing that's very convincing on this is the really hard-nosed financial analysis. I think this is a great thing for both people and planets, but it helps to have really serious financial commentators saying this is the way to go. If you don't do this, you're going to lose out. At some point, fossil fuel assets will become stranded. When that happens, if you're still invested in them, people are going to lose out. So it doesn't hurt to get out of them now. It will hurt if you delay. The writing's on the wall for fossil fuels. This is going to happen sooner or later. Enfield Council should get ahead of the curve, do it as soon as possible, and make sure that we've got a future-proof pension that benefits both people and planet.
Okay, well, we're getting very close to the end of this interview now, which has been great, and you've talked very fluently about it. But, let's assume that in a couple of months' time, Enfield says, yep, we're going to de-invest from fossil fuels. What will you be doing then? You're still going to be in the environmental area, aren't you? That's what you want to do. What will your future be then?
That's a really good question. So we will continue on this campaign until they divest. There's a great slogan that I saw from one of the other divestment groups in London. They had a banner that said, "We won't be resting till you start divesting." And that's basically what we'll be doing in Enfield. But when we're done with this campaign, and I hope it comes to a successful conclusion sooner rather than later, I'm really interested in looking into building bigger environmental groups in Enfield. Is there something we can do about air pollution? Is there something we can do about traffic? What about pesticide use? There are no shortage of environmental problems, and that is, I was just thinking today, I've been an environmentalist since I was a teenager, and as you can probably tell by looking at me, I'm not a teenager anymore. But I think the one good thing about being an environmentalist is there's no shortage of things to work on. There will always be things for us to do. I think what will happen next will depend how fast the Enfield Council divests, but I think the next thing will probably be some kind of air pollution campaign. Everywhere you go in London, there is illegal levels of air pollution, and that affects our lungs, that affects our hearts, our brains even. You know, we found that out recently. There was an article in The Lancet about how air pollution affects our brains and our brain development. That's a public health crisis, and I think once Enfield Council has decided to divest, I'll move on to trying to organise something around that. So I'm committed to Enfield for the long haul, very happy to be here, and looking forward to getting as involved in the community as possible.
Okay, well, thank you very much for doing that. So it seems you are going to be around for a long time, and that's great. So if anybody wants to get in touch with you, then they can do that through us, or if when we put this up on, or even on the live stream, you could put a comment underneath, Adam, with your contact details so that they can get contact with you.
Absolutely.
For anyone interested in that, you know, please contact Adam. And clearly, if you're interested in other environmental things like pollution, Adam's interested in that as well. And please contact him for that. So thank you for joining us, Adam. And it's been a great hour, and it's gone very, very quickly. So thank you, and I'm sure we'll hear from you again in the future.
Thanks very much, Francis, and thanks for the opportunity to talk.
Okay, so we'll end the interview now. Thanks.